1864, Civil War and Reconstruction. We're going to jump right in with the March decision by Lincoln. Now, we have covered the weaknesses of some of the commanders that Lincoln has employed previously. Of course, Little Mac, McClellan, his caution, Meade's inability to chase the enemy, fighting Joe Hooker's ironic lack of fighting. So March 9th, 1864, Lincoln decides enough is enough. He names Grant commander of all armies in the U.S. in hopes that he can duplicate his own successes in the West. William Tecumseh Sherman succeeds Grant as commander in the West. Meade is not fired. Grant keeps him to manage the army while Grant supervises the entirety of the war. Now, there are significant rumors that the two did not get along. This is something that Mark Grimsley, for example, will argue against in his discussion of the Overland campaign. The two did have contrasting styles, but apparently did work well enough together. After all, they did earn a victory. Still, the differences were notable during Overland. So Grant comes to Washington, and we know about his past. He's somewhat haggardly. There is a lot of doubt among observers in D.C. Quote, he had the look of a man who did or once did take a little too much to drink. There are some famous stories about Grant's drinking, and even on the battlefield. I think these are a little bit overblown at times. Quote, he had no gait, no station, no manner. He was rough, and indeed he was rough. He came from the West. He had lived a hard life somewhat. And there's been a lot of issue lately with the fact that Grant had a slave. And there's some context. Of course, the study of history is about context. Grant was an abolitionist. His father was a rabid abolitionist. His father was one of the leading abolitionists in his area. Grant took after him. Now, he was not as vociferous as his father with regard to this issue, but he did not support slavery. And in fact, once the Confederacy had been established, he was livid about this situation and wanted to end slavery. He realized that was not the initial reasoning for the war on the Union's part, but again, this was one of his goals. He had one slave. It was given to him by his father-in-law. He did not want this slave, and he would actually work alongside his slave. And then he would eventually free his slave with no compensation. Now, to us today, of course, he didn't take compensation. Well, back then, that was a pretty big deal. When he went to give his slave his freedom, he was criticized at the time. He was criticized for working in the fields next to his slave. But Grant, again, was not somebody who supported slavery. He did not want a slave, and again, that is why he freed his slave. So consider some of the nuances again. Yes, he had a slave, but what are the conditions? What all is around that? So again, Grant comes to D.C. His new strategy, well, shouldn't be that new. Take advantage of the North's superior manpower, the North's superior materials. And he would conduct simultaneous advances with Union armies on the Confederacy so that the CSA had to divide its forces or leave territory open to invasions. There was no longer space for shuttling troops back and forth, no longer an attempt to capture and hold enemy territory. The new goal was to simply destroy the rebel armies. No more waiting around, no more months off, no more long preparations, but a full-on assault to end the war. He would meet with Sherman in a Cincinnati hotel room to devise their plan. Grant would go to Virginia. Sherman would go to the West. We know what happens. We're going to get to that. Sherman and Grant did have a solid friendship. This would develop during the war. Both were failures prior to the war. Sherman was a failed businessman. Grant actually at one point needed to sell his gold watch just to buy his children Christmas gifts. In 1861, Sherman was considered crazy. He was overwhelmed. He was sent home. He would be hospitalized. Family connections would ultimately get him a new assignment with Grant. Grant himself had almost resigned in 1862 when he was demoted, but it is notable that some historians argue that Sherman is the one who kept Grant in the war. Now, Grant, again, would reanalyze Union advantages. He realized they had the numbers, that they could fight the war of attrition and win. Generals up to this point, of course, were hesitant to fight full on. They often retreated. They did not give chase. They thought that the Confederacy had more troops than they had in these different battles. They were easily outfoxed. Grant would have none of that. Grant was pretty straightforward. So a few months after this, in July, Jubal Early, a noted Confederate general, would lead his troops into Maryland, and he would provide some relief to Lee acting as a diversionary tactic at the time. He would get within 5 miles of the District of Columbia, but on July 13th, 1864, he would be driven back. Upon his retreat, Early's troops are followed by the Union, ultimately under George Crook. Early would win battles at Cool Spring and Kernstown, but William Sheridan would arrive. He would win victories at 3rd Winchester. Then he would flank Early at Fisher's Hill. Early flees south. He is followed by Sheridan, who begins the burning in the valley, destroying barns, mills, crops, or anything else that could be helpful to the Confederates. Battles at Tom's Crook and Woodstock. Eventually, Sheridan unleashes his cavalry on Early's forces at Tom's Brook. Early flees south again. This would become known as the Woodstock Races. Finally, in October 1864, Cavalry General Philip H. Sheridan, not William, Philip, defeats Jubal Early's troops in Shenandoah Valley. Thus, the focus is squarely on Grant and Lee at Richmond. Of course, the Richmond campaign will develop over the next year. Initially, Early's surprise attack had routed the Union Army. In the afternoon, though, Sheridan would launch his crushing counterattack, retaking the field, and his victory here at Cedar Creek broke the back of Confederates in Shenandoah Valley. We're going to get to the importance of that in the second video lecture with 1864. But first, we're going to get to Sherman's March. Of course, this is a famous part of the war. We had discussed regarding 1863, Sherman's battle against Confederate forces at Chattanooga. This opens up the South for invasion from the West. He would engage Joseph Johnston's army, which somehow would hold back Sherman's men, even though the latter were twice as numerous. 100,000 men to 60,000 of Johnston's Army of the Tennessee. In May, the beginning of confrontations between the two for North Georgia. The Union held clear numerical superiority. But Sherman did not make this simply a war of attrition. He strategically placed his generals in different places. He attacked Johnston's left flank to threaten his supply line. This would work repeatedly. The Confederates would withdraw from Dalton, would continue to withdraw from its fronts throughout May. At Kennesaw Mountain, Johnston was dug in. He repelled Sherman's assault, but would be flanked again. Sherman's own fake at this point would help to force the Southern Army to retreat back to Atlanta in early July. Sherman himself, again, a wily general, knew that sometimes it's not just about numbers. Sometimes you have to be a little bit more deft. And he shows this again. This is part, I won't get into the details here, but his fake at Kennesaw Mountain would again kind of lead to the Confederacy to back away and almost pull a McClellan. Now, what's going on at this time? Davis does not trust Johnston. He is upset by Johnston's loss of territory, his inability to attack Sherman. He would replace him with John Hood. By the time this occurred, July 18th, the Union Army was only 5 miles outside of Atlanta. Hood would attack superior Union forces, something Davis wanted, but Johnston avoided doing, and Hood would continue to lose. Sherman looked to cut supplies to Atlanta and starve Hood out. Battles would ensue. Finally, toward the end of August, Union troops were able to head well south of Atlanta, cut the railroad, severing the last line of supplies to Atlanta. Now, I had mentioned this happens in July. On September 1st, at late night, Hood would ultimately abandon Atlanta. The next day, September 2nd, 1864, Sherman's army would capture Atlanta. Now, why is Atlanta so important? It's a munitions center, it's a railroad hub, it's the industrial center of the Confederacy. This was where the Confederate Army's food supplies, weapons, and other goods were kept. This was also a symbol of Confederate pride and strength. Atlanta was arguably the Confederacy's most beautiful and successful city. When Sherman left it in ruins, this had a devastating psychological effect. Now, the Confederacy would play a part in this as well, just as they would do in Richmond, as their entrenchments and detonation of ammo was part of Hood's evacuation, and this would contribute to the decimation. Again, destroy anything that your opponent might be able to utilize. We see this in Atlanta, and again, following in Richmond, which we'll get to when we get to 1865. South Carolinian Mary Boykin Chestnut, one of the major observers of the Civil War. Her writings on the war have captured the imagination of millions since the war, both in northern and southern states, really across the world. And her firsthand account of the battles, again, are well known. She stated, quote, "Since Atlanta, I have felt as if we are going to be wiped off the earth." So Atlanta does not mean the end of the Confederacy per se, but it's pretty close. And again, psychologically, the defeat is massive to Confederate civilians as well as fighters. Now, Richmond, of course, is where the capital is. That's still standing. The Confederates have that to defend, and they will do so very strongly. But with the destruction of Atlanta, again, a lot has been accomplished here. So again, Sherman, his troops would destroy Atlanta's warehouses, railroad facilities. They would destroy all of Atlanta's war-making potential. And this, of course, is politically potentially important for Lincoln, right? This is September. Elections are held in what, November? So getting close. Now, once Sherman is there, he would rest for 2.5 months, accumulating supplies. In November, he would begin his march to the sea with 62,000 men, claiming, quote, "I can make Georgia howl." He initiates total war on this march to the sea. This was a scorched earth campaign. What is scorched earth? It is leaving destruction in its wake. It leaves no quarter. Now, I used to joke, I nicknamed my daughter Tecumseh when she was a toddler because she left everything destroyed that was in her way. And that's what we see with Tecumseh. This would be the strategy used by military leaders going forward in other wars as well. Destroy everything in the path that was of use to the opponent. Burn down farms when necessary. Basically, anything that could be put to use by the Confederacy for the sake of the war was to be destroyed. This was warfare revolution, to be sure. Again, Sherman and Grant together changed the way that this war is prosecuted. So one thing that we see, cut these supply lines. Now, this is not only to cut him and his troops off from their necessary supplies, this also freed all of his troops for movement and fighting rather than have to relegate some for logistical duty. By cutting these supply lines, again, you don't have a section of your troops who are staying back, who are doing this or that. You can put everybody, again, toward this full frontal assault. There were no lines of communication. Telegraph line was cut to prevent intelligence reports from reaching the enemy or from reaching Washington. But again, this cuts down on some of the logistical difficulties. This allows for a more straightforward approach. There's no way to retreat for the Union, but of course, retreat is not in the vocabulary of a Sherman or Grant. There is considerable secrecy. He told his officers and troops little about his plans. The common sentiment was, quote, "Uncle Billy, I guess Grant is waiting for us in Richmond." They didn't know what was going on. And of course, there were plans to have his men live off the land. This gets to Special Order 120. There were 2 wings of the Army taking 4 roads, no supply lines. Foraging units were to be created. Corps commanders were allowed to order devastation of areas depending on the situation. If the Union troops were harassed at all, if they met any kind of significant defense, total destruction. That said, if they were approached, easy surrender, people did not attack them in their own defense, then they spared that area, that town, that village, that farm. And we're going to get to this in a little bit because much has been made of Sherman and his atrocities, but were they really as atrocious as we might think? Soldiers might take wagons, horses, mules from these Confederates, from their inhabitants if they deemed them necessary. I mentioned living off the land. We have the initiation of what are called bummers. Love the name. These were those who did the foraging. They pillaged. They didn't fit in with the others in the military, and they would be key in this march to the sea because, again, they would go out, they would get the necessary materials, the necessary supplies from these farms, from these towns, whatever. They foraged, they pillaged, they took what they needed, and they would bring them back. Oftentimes, too, this would lead to a new sense of camaraderie when they would sit around the campfires, if you will. They would tell stories of their foraging to those who were just fighting. And so, again, this led to some interesting stories told within each other. So the bummers, again, act as for logistical importance, but also they kind of have this psychological effect. Now, a few things to consider. Again, we often view Sherman as this butcher. Of course, that's Grant's nickname. One who thrived and enjoyed the death and destruction of his methodology. And if you've seen images of Sherman, there's one image where you can see, yeah, he looks crazy. He looks determined. And Sherman indeed was fiery. I mean, he was an intense individual, but he was not one who necessarily enjoyed killing and destroying. In reality, he wanted to minimize loss on both sides. He was not a cruel man, he was a compassionate man. One reason for this was that he was friends with many in the Confederate Army. He had served with them before the war, he went to school with them. He had also recognized that there would be a post-war reality, and that if the Union wanted to unite and succeed after the war was over, there would need to be some show of peace, a show of humility, and a show of willingness to work together. Now, when we finished up with 1863, we talked about Lincoln's very liberal Reconstruction plan, 10%, his 10% plan. Many criticized this, but he, along with Grant, along with Sherman, recognized there's going to be a post-war reality, and we need to set the stage for this. Thus, when Sherman captured a town, his terms were often more generous and flexible than history might tell us. Now, why did Sherman practice this destructive war? Why would he be willing to decimate towns or farms? Why would he destroy everything in his wake? Part of this was he wanted to convince Confederate citizens that ultimately they could they could not win the war, and B, their government could not protect them from federal forces. This is similar to Lee's vision when he went up into Union territory, but this was Sherman, again, these two key things. You're not going to win the war, and you can't be protected. So when people, again, are willing to surrender and come to him peacefully, hey, he's fine with it. And there are many stories of Sherman taking care of the wives and children of soldiers and generals who left towns and left them peacefully and asked him to help out. And he would. He took care of these people. That said, if you fought back, if you came up in his face and argued, no, we're not gonna give in so easily, then you faced total destruction. Basically, Southerners controlled their own destiny in this way. As long as they remained in rebellion, they would suffer at his hands. If they surrendered, he would be magnanimous and spare them further humiliation. Sherman and his underlings sought to destroy the enemy's will and logistics with this shock and awe method. And again, they would succeed. Now, initially, the plan again was for Sherman to engage Hood's army and destroy it. But Sherman convinced both Grant and Lincoln to deviate. Sherman took his best troops on the destructive march to the sea, leaving George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, to contain Hood. Now, we're going to get more to this below, but rather than go and deal with Hood up in Tennessee, Sherman continues his march. And this march would indeed create shock and awe. Sherman and his troops did not destroy any of the towns in their path, but for foraging reasons, they did steal food and livestock when possible. This is the march to the sea, not the march to Atlanta. Those who fought back found their homes and barns burned to the ground. Again, the goal to inspire fear, prove to Confederate folks that the Union was going to win, and it was in their best interest to surrender. Sherman, according to Sherman, you need to, quote, make old and young, rich and poor feel the hard hand of war. And he succeeded in this. There was little resistance to Sherman and his troops on their march to the sea. His men would destroy tunnels and bridges. They rendered the railroad useless by mangling railroad tracks. These became known as Sherman neckties. Along with this destruction, Sherman showed great wile. W-I-L-E. He fooled Confederates into believing one part of his army was going to Augusta and the other to Macon, when in reality he was going to the Georgia capital of Milledgeville. Each of the Confederate leaders in the region fell for this, further facilitating his path. Sherman reached 10 miles outside of Milledgeville, and the capital city panicked. The state legislature extended all existing draft to include all men from 16 to 65. Think about that. Prisoners in the state jail were willing to take up arms, would be freed. That's not a good idea. Many sought escape, of course. Soldiers would damage state buildings. They would destroy books and manuscripts before leaving. The march itself covered as much as 15 miles a day. For the most part, the marching through the day left no time for rest. There were no lunch breaks. There were no cigarette breaks. There was no stopping for anything. The men marched all day until nightfall. At nightfall, they would make their first full meal of the day, sit around and converse. And again, it is during these dinners that the bummers would tell their stories to the other soldiers. And the bummers, as I mentioned earlier, became experts at scavenging. They found hidden food, horses, wagons, valuables, keepsakes. But part of their method was instilling fear. Some homes would be destroyed, some untouched. Thus, they were unpredictable, and those who knew they were coming were struck with fear. This also led to false accusations, but accusations which only supported the whole idea of the march. There were rumors of rape, reports of useless murder, but these were minimal if they happened at all. Many studies have been done on this. Certainly this occurred, but again, actually not nearly as numerous as has been made out to be. But again, this only reflects his psychological tactics that were working. Georgians were scared to death. This also led to more slaves trying to join up with Sherman and his men on their march. They viewed Sherman and his troops as their emancipators and helped in different ways. Some became laborers and performed some of the basic tasks necessary for the advances. Others simply followed the columns. The white soldiers in Sherman's columns did not treat them as equals, nor did they show them respect. This kept many slaves at a distance, but still they were much part of the whole. Now, this gets to one of the more horrific dates in American history. December 9th, 1864 at Ebenezer Creek. This was certainly one of the most horrific dates for slaves. Federals under the command of Jefferson C. Davis, not Jefferson Davis, Jefferson C. Davis. Imagine having the same name as the president of your opponent. Anyway, these Federals crossed a flooded creek on a pontoon bridge, ordered the long line of fugitive slaves, there were around 650 of them, to wait for a signal before crossing. But when the last unit crossed, they lashed the bridge, leaving the fugitives stranded on the other side of the creek. The Confederate cavalry was nearby. Many fugitives were scared of capture or killing. They panicked. They jumped into the water to try to swim across. Some Federals did attempt to help, but a large number drowned or worse were captured by arriving Confederate troops. Sherman ultimately blamed the refugees. He had advised them not to follow the army. Of course they did. This made sense from their point of view. And this is, I think, one of the errors in Sherman's logic, I guess, if we, with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, of course, looking at it strategically, he realized I cannot feed, I cannot take care of, shelter, etc. These people, they need to not follow us. Still, one understands why they did. And again, it's one of the more tragic days in our history. December 21st, Sherman would reach Savannah, leaving behind 300 miles of destruction, 60 miles wide, all the way from Atlanta. Sherman telegraphed Lincoln, offering him Savannah as a Christmas present. This is a famous dictum, of course, you've certainly heard of that. True to his methods, the damage and destruction ceased immediately. Hardee's army was allowed to escape the city. Sherman certainly could have destroyed them, but again, allowed them to escape. Part of this, again, is logistical. We can't feed, etc., take care of them. Soldiers who had previously foraged and instilled fear now took residence in the city and acted as gentlemen. Sherman himself brought supply ships from the north to feed those in the city and begin the path to normalcy. Several Confederate generals even left their wives and children to Sherman's personal protection, which he took pains to do. What conclusions can we draw? Total warfare was pretty darn successful, both for what it did and for what it led Southerners to imagine was done or would be done. Sherman viewed destruction of property as more important than taking lives at this point. There were fewer than 3,000 casualties during his 6-week march. Compare that to 51,000 at Gettysburg over 3 days. Now, again, there's a lot of discussion about Sherman being a butcher, practicing methods that were not necessary, killing too many, being too violent. But again, if you look at this 6-week march, fewer than 3,000 casualties compared to 51 over 3 days at Gettysburg. Obviously, it was not as violent or as murderous as has been claimed. Some claim that Sherman remains in the psyche of Southerners today. Let's get to one more battle, and then we will move, and then we will end this specific lecture. In November, I had mentioned Hood, a Confederate general who Davis puts a lot of faith in. Hood would move his men toward Nashville in an attempt to get Sherman out of Georgia and an attempt to cut supply lines. Sherman would initially skirmish with him, but then he left George Thomas and commander of the Army of the Cumberland to do so. Hood desired to move north and defeat Thomas's army before it could consolidate, take Nashville, and continue into Kentucky, eventually coming to meet Lee in Virginia. How it went down. November 29th at Spring Hill, we have Hood versus Schofield. Nathan Bedford Forrest troopers versus James Wilson's Union cavalry. This was an opportunity for Hood to isolate the Union army, but his attack is staggered and cautious. Schofield's men retreat at night to Franklin. Hood would chase them, which gets us to Franklin the next day, November 30th. Hood chases Schofield to Franklin, where Union troops form a defensive line with works previously established by the Union in the spring of 1863. The Federals Federals fight Hood's rebels off, causing over 6,000 Confederate casualties. 6 generals would be killed or suffered mortal wounds at this battle as well. There were only 2,300 Union casualties, but still Hood would fight on. Half a month later, December 15th, through the 16th, Hood's army would be crushed at Nashville. 23,000 troops to 55,000 Federals. So it's not even close, well over twice the number in the Union military. This included African American troops under George Thomas. The first day's fighting crushed Hood and his men, yet he remained confident once fighting stopped due to darkness. On the second day, the Union would finish the job. Hood's army retreats and is chased for 10 days by the Union until they cross the Tennessee River. Hood would go to Tupelo and resign. Not good times for the Confederacy. Davis is increasingly unpopular. By the winter of 1864, his critics are the majority. They refuse his request for control over state militias. They reject his pleas to end all exemptions from conscription. The president's closest friends are slowly weeded out of cabinet positions by the Confederate Congress. And again, we are on the doorstep of Union victory.